Today's subject on artificial intelligence and its role within our Islamic context. I will touch upon this and give my point of view by analyzing from an Islamic perspective. If you can get some tea, please. Tea, yeah. And with every new technology, there is a response to that technology. Even something like exams, yearly exams. This was something invented in Cambridge, England, in the 1700s. Prior to that, as far as I am aware, there was no such thing as yearly annual examinations. This was introduced in that time by one of the employees at Cambridge University, and then later through the British Empire, it spread within the colonies of the British Empire that people now think examinations, yearly examinations, are something standard and you cannot do without yearly examinations. But anyone who is a teacher will inform you that the intelligence of a student is not actually judged by examinations. There could be some students who may take a few years to develop and mature. Other students may pass exams, but there may be students who are much more skilled at a later date because it takes time for them to mature and understand the subject matter. But what we have been made to believe is that students, their intelligence is only demonstrated by yearly examinations. That is how a process may change the way we think, but it can also affect how we can be affected is also through the introduction of new technologies. New technologies will change the way we think. An example of that is the pen and paper, note-taking. When students over 25 years ago, quarter of a century, they would attend lectures, they would write down notes. But now, with the introduction of smartphones and iPads, people type down what they hear from their professor or lecturer, and that affects perhaps handwriting. If you observe the handwriting, many young people now cannot even write letters. They do not know how to write a letter, except that they will know about emails. But that is how the technology has affected that human being. Similarly, tape recorders. In the 1990s, prior to the introduction of the smartphone and the iPad, a person would attend a lecture, but they would rely on their tape recorders. They would make tape recordings of the lecture. That could affect the way students memorize lectures when the lectures are delivered. Because if you are not utilizing a tape recorder, you're following through a book, a text, or you are listening to the lecture, you will concentrate more because you are not relying upon a recorder. Like one of the ulama in Pakistan, Al-Allama Ata Muhammad Bandialwi Rahimullah, he never permitted recordings. He said concentrate on the lecture, and he never permitted note-taking also. Some of our teachers wouldn't permit extensive note-taking. They would say just write shorthand because you concentrate on the lecture that is being delivered and understand, be cognizant of what is being delivered. But technologies, they affect the way our minds work. An example of this is AI, but as well as that, social media. Today we have TikTok, where young people cannot concentrate for more than a minute of a lecture, because that is how the TikTok has affected their minds. That when they listen to a TikTok clip for half a minute, then their mind will switch off. Sometimes what people do is that they fast forward the clip. So someone showed me my own clips. They're fast forwarding the clip. I said, why are you fast forwarding the clip here? They said, because young people may find you speaking too slow. So they need to hear the point very quickly or their minds will switch off. That is how the technology has affected them. Otherwise, decades ago, people would sit in gatherings, Islamic gatherings, and listen to lectures for hours, one lecture after the other. They would concentrate. But then what has happened in the later times is lectures have been replaced with entertainment. So like the presidency in the United States of America, the presidency, from the introduction of cameras and television, who the presidential candidate is and standing would affect the mind of the voter because of the visuals involved. So they would say, of course we know Ronald Reagan was a former actor. Arnold Schwarzenegger was the candidate in California, and he became the governor of California. But he's a former actor. So when people are voting, they are not voting Arnold Schwarzenegger, they are voting the Terminator. That is what they are thinking. So that is how the minds have become affected with technologies that get introduced. Prior to that, perhaps a presidential candidate would be voted on his intelligence and his policies. But now what people look for, and this has happened with Islamic speeches also, is people look for entertainment. Entertainment and charisma. So they judge the lecture through charisma, or they will judge it through the visuals. What visuals you may have, sound bites, but no deep concentration of the actual content of the lecture, of what is being delivered. So that is how technologies affect society. Like I mentioned, the iPad affected handwriting. It's a skill to write, but the younger generation, when you check their handwriting, it could be very awful because they are not doing letter writing in school. They are not practicing their handwriting. Similarly, reading skills, the diminishing nature of reading skills. After reading, and if they even read fluently at all, comprehension skills, the comprehension of what you are reading, understanding what you are reading. Vocabulary is affected. People now, they complain, they say, lower the standard of your English because people cannot understand. That does not mean the public speaker has a high standard of English. It means the level of the listening audience has decreased. That they have been dumbed down, a population that has been dumbed down through technologies like television, technologies like the internet. The internet actually dumbs you down because you rely on the internet, but there are people who do not even know how to utilize the technologies correctly. So many people, they will not know how to utilize Google correctly. There is a method of utilizing technology also. So that is how technologies affect human interactions and human understanding. Today, earlier, I was talking about the late Al-Alama Abdul Alim As-Siddiqui, rahimahullah ta'ala, a man who in the 1920s and 1930s was far advanced in his age, the age he lived in the time he lived in terms of lack of mass communication. If an event occurs at one end of the globe, it takes time for the news to reach the other side of the globe. There was no mass communication. Yet he was able to travel all over the world and establish Islamic centers in far-flung places like the West Indies, in Trinidad, Tobago, in Guyana, in Suriname, all these areas that he visited. He established Islamic centers. And he had an international impact throughout Africa, even holding a meeting with George Bernard Shaw. In that time when communications were difficult and there was no social media. Now, despite having all these means of communication, the correct message of Islam must be spread by Muslims across the globe, meaning the correct understanding of the deen of Islam. So if we do not convey our deen, then it is our own falling short of our responsibility. If we cannot convey the deen to the people, because the means of conveying the deen of Allah are within our reach. In this day and age, we have all the technology. There are TV stations, there is internet, there is WhatsApp, all these means by which we can convey the correct message of Islam. But if our efforts are wasted in those things, in entertaining our egos, rather than defending the Qur'an, rather than defending Islam, rather than defending the honor of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, instead of carrying out that obligation, if we are utilizing this technology for false ends, for ends which have no purpose except to gratify our egos, then this is our falling short of the responsibility of conveying the correct message of Islam, especially living in Europe. When you live in non-Muslim majority countries, the obligation, the fard of conveying the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is upon every individual. Do not think living in these countries, our job is not to convey the deen of Islam in its correct manner. We as Muslims, we cannot live as a cult in our own enclaves, except that we interact with the wider communities. And when we interact with the wider communities, we convey the correct message of Islam. That is an obligation, a fard upon us. And with the means of communication today, that fard becomes even more pressing. With artificial intelligence, this AI also affects the way people think. For instance, if you ask AI, there is of course the Western search engine that they utilize, which is what is it known as? ChatGPT. And there is the Chinese deep search. You ask the same question from both applications, you will get different answers. So you ask ChatGPT about 9/11. ChatGPT will give you what the 9/11 Commission report mentions, which unsurprisingly, the 9/11 Commission report was carried out by Henry Kissinger. So It tells you with regard to how the the two buildings they fell. It's in accordance with the report. Meaning, I've read the entire report, and that if you check you ask ChatGPT the questions, it's in accordance with that. Because the application, the artificial intelligence takes its response from specific sources. But if you ask DeepSeek the same question, you will get a different response. You ask DeepSeek regarding Israel, you will get a different response to ChatGPT. Two different responses. If you ask ChatGPT, is Benjamin Netanyahu a war criminal? Is the state of Israel illegal? Should there be one state solution, not a two-state solution? Does the entire Palestine belong to Palestinians or to the Muslims? You will get a different response from both artificial intelligence because they have been programmed differently. Therefore, the response is different. But is this limited to this domain? The answer is no. For instance, you ask ChatGPT with regard to Islamic fatwa, it will its response will be wrong in many cases. Sometimes it will quote Fatawa Alamgiri, which is known as Al-Fatawa Al-Hindiya, and it will misquote Al-Fatawa Al-Hindiya. So when you go back to the original sources and you check, you will find that the response is actually incorrect. Therefore, ChatGPT or Deep Search cannot be relied upon, but I believe the long-term effect of what is referred to as artificial intelligence is a further dumbing down of the population. Technologies, if people do not know how to utilize those technologies, they will be dumbed down. Like, for instance, when we watch the news, we watch the news in a particular way. We know that the news which is owned, the news groups are owned by different corporations and different governments, and therefore the news is propaganda. But if a person passively watches the news, and when he watches the news, he has no critical mind or critical method of observing the news, knowing that the news is partial and the news is only displaying a part of the entire story, and a person is unable to decipher the facts, then they fall into what is known as brainwashing, what is known as thought reform. Your thoughts are reformed, and a person, his critical faculty is removed. The worst thing is a person who thinks that they are actually critical, but they do not have the tools to analyze critically. They do not have the means to analyze critically. They do not have the basic logic of being able to analyze and critique what they are observing on the news. Similarly, in previous times, newspapers became something people now think were absolutely necessary. But in reality, there is information overload in newspapers. You read the newspapers, there is so much information that if you were really to be critical, you will realize you do not need the majority of the information found in the newspapers. Why do you need to know about certain crimes that do not actually affect you? So there is a dramatization in newspapers, but people think that they need to read certain newspapers in order to seem intelligent, in order to seem relevant. And similarly with the news channels that people watch without the critical method, without knowing how to critically analyze the propaganda that is being displayed on the news. The AI changes things because some people, they utilize AI now to receive a response on those things which they are not specialists, or they may seem to be specialists. So they utilize AI and they may read the AI response and convey the AI response as their own response. But this is unprofessional. This is amateur people behaving like professionals. It's like someone who is a medical student. He goes on to the AI and he asks the AI critical questions regarding the medical practice. Imagine a surgeon or a person pretending to be a surgeon. He goes to do surgery in the hospital, but he is unsure. Things are convoluted. He becomes confused. So he asks AI, how do I carry out this surgery? Now he may have semi-professionalism or a semi-technical know-how, but eventually he will do something that will actually harm the patient, because AI will make mistakes. AI only gives a response in accordance with the information that it is fed. AI cannot be relied upon, but an expert in his field will be able to fault AI. Like, for instance, if there is a brain surgeon who has been carrying out brain surgery for over 20 years, and then someone who is a student of brain surgery, he asks AI certain questions, but he is unsure. The human intelligence of the brain surgeon who has been dealing with brain surgery for over 20 years is more reliable than the AI. In fact, the brain surgeon will be able to correct the AI. So AI will never replace human technical experience and human intelligence. But AI will have a role where it can simplify certain concepts for the non-professional, but it should not be utilized by the professional in his field. A person may need clarity through AI, but even today, if you ask AI certain questions in Nahu, in Arabic grammar, AI will make mistakes. That means AI will never replace the ulama who teach Nahu. A scholar who has been teaching Nahu for 10 to 20 years, he will know Nahu better than AI. Or he will be able to find the mistakes that AI may display. So sometimes the mistake may be actually very subtle, but only the professional in his field is able to pick up on that mistake. And this is with all the fields, whether it is the medical field, whether it is rocket science, any field, a person who is practically engaged in that field will be able to give you a better response regarding that field. The role of AI today, we observed in the war in Gaza, where governments have a level of AI which the public does not have. So there are different engines of AI. Twitter, which is known as X, has its own AI. Then you have different AI applications. But governments, or certain governments, have their own AI. What is referred to as Israel, this illegal entity has been utilizing AI in its war on Gaza. And while utilizing AI in its war on Gaza, claiming that AI is able to pinpoint designated locations of what they refer to as terrorist networks, instead of killing these presumed terrorist networks, it has killed women and children and civilians in general. That is how AI has been misused by what is referred to as the Israeli military. That is what we observe today. So this also demonstrates that AI is unreliable. Like recently, Mossad and Shin Bet, the so-called Israeli intelligence services, claimed to have killed Abu Ubaidah, the spokesman. And they released photographs of Abu Ubaidah supposedly in a conference room with Muhammad Daif, the military commander. But it turns out that the pictures were false. They are hoax, because the number of fingers on some of the pictures, the digits on the fingers are less. So AI has not even overcome this problem, that there are still faults to be fine-tuned within AI. But what we are discussing is AI being utilized in order to replace ulama. The answer is that cannot happen. An alim who teaches the book Al-Quduri for 20 years, he knows all its commentaries, he has been asked multiple questions by students in an organic fashion, and through that organic experience, that alim can respond to your question better than AI. Like a doctor who has been working in his surgery for 30 years, has been dealing with various cases, and has had organic dealing with the patients. That person can give a better response than AI. That is the role of AI, that in our Islamic construct, AI is a technology like all other technologies, but like every technology has benefits, there are also flaws, there are also harms. So it is essential for teachers, for institutions, for parents to realize the benefits and harms of these technologies. Like today, we observe that parents give smartphones to young children. What this does, aside from damaging the eyesight, it gets a child addicted to the phone, where the child needs the phone in order to behave. Mothers, in order to nurse their children, sometimes may make the child watch endless TV, or in worst case scenarios, to go on the internet. Children as young as 4 and 5. How is this rewiring the brain, changing the way children may interact, to the point that it seems that autism has become quite widespread in certain societies? The younger people, they do not know how to interact. They are unable to interact. Some of them will have social anxiety, or they will sit in a gathering, but they are unable to have the confidence to speak or to express themselves, different to a generation that was not nurtured on these modern technologies. We observe the millennials, they are different to pre-millennials in terms of reading skills, in terms of interaction, in terms of social skills, because of how these technologies are affecting the human mind. And because of that, it becomes essential for everyone in a position of authority to ensure that the young children are not addicted. In fact, they should not be near phones. They should not be binge watching on television. They should not have iPads or iPhones. They do not need those things. They do not need those technologies. They must resort back to reading and writing, to reading books. But how does that happen? Some of them may say that this is boring, going back to books. Well, imagine that you are in a house, in a home, and in that home, when the child is at home, there are bookcases filled with different books and different subjects. But there is a lack of devices, like the Game Boy, or the Nintendo Switch, or the PlayStation. These type of things are not in the house. That child now, whom you have instructed to read and write, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, that is essential education. But that child now is forced to read a book. He goes to the bookshelf, he picks up a novel, he reads the novel, he finishes one novel, he goes to another. What benefit does that have? It is how the mind is wired in reading now. Because in order to entertain his mind, in order to have the mind release chemicals that make you feel good instead of resorting to television, instead of resorting to computer games, instead of resorting to other technologies. That young man or young woman is resorting to old school reading. And then it increases their vocabulary. When they read books, they come across words. The increase of vocabulary increases your expansion of thought. If you remember the book 1984 of George Orwell, in that book, what he has a fictitious government in Britain or in the Western Hemisphere. The fictitious government, what does it do every year? It reduces the dictionary. It incinerates books. It decreases vocabulary. Why does it decrease the vocabulary? Because the more vocabulary individuals possess, the more they are able to think. When you have more words to think with, you are able to think better. The abstraction of thought is applied in various fields of life because you have so many words to speak with. But when you decrease the vocabulary, you are unable to think. You cannot think around a subject. So in 1984, the government decreases the vocabulary so they do not have a thinking population. Of course, most governments would want a population that cannot think, because then their government is not in any danger. But when you have a population that is intelligent, then governments are in danger. And that is why we need to resort to reading. Some people, they ask a very odd question. That odd question is that some people who ostensibly seem religious, they say to me that, are we allowed to read novels and books? And I say, yes, of course you are permitted to read novels and books. They become surprised because in their minds they think they are only permitted to read Islamic literature. But that goes against the very ethos of the ulama, because I'm sure in this madrasa and other madaris you study Maqamatul Hariri, you study Al-Mutanabbi, you study the different poetry and literature. Kalila wa Dimna is story, it's a story book. They study literature in Dars Nizami, they study story books. They had Yusuf Zulaykha, written by Jalaluddin, written by Mullah Jami, Abdurrahman al-Jami rahimahullah. These were story books. Why were they reading story books in Dars Nizami? Because the story books increase your knowledge of language, of culture, of everything around you. That is why children are permitted to read novels. They are permitted to read books in general, because it will increase their knowledge of the world. They will not be narrow-minded, because the Sahaba alayhimu ridwan, when they conquered the world, when they conquered the Roman Empire, think to yourself, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu an was Khalifa. How do you think Sayyidina Umar radiallahu an had knowledge of the world? Na'udhu billah. The Sahaba were not ignorant of the world around them. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu an, he conquers the Roman Empire, and the Sahaba conquered the Roman Empire. They of course knew about Roman aqueducts. They knew about Roman roads. They knew about Roman measurements, about Roman civilization. That is why the Sahaba were able to establish the Khilafah. But if we think the ulama of today should be people limited to a madrasa and not know what is occurring in the world around them and have no knowledge of the world around them, then this is ignorance, because none of the imams were like this. Yes, they were zahid. They stayed away from acquiring the world, but that didn't make them ignorant of the world. Today you have people pretending to be zuhad, but they have all the dunya, they have beautiful homes, beautiful cars, but then when it will come to general knowledge of the world, they will say, oh, we do not discuss such things because we are so religious. If you are so religious like a Salafus Salihun, then why do you have so many material things? But a Salafus Salihun were knowledgeable about the world that was around them. That is why it's a fard on the ulama today to know about world economy, to know about world history, to know about geography, to know about languages, to know about cultures, to know different aspects of knowledge is fard on the ulama. They cannot say, oh, we do not know about this thing and we do not know about that thing. But when it comes to benefit fraud, they are very quick at knowing everything to do with benefit fraud. Or when it comes to earning money, they are very quick at earning money. But they do not know the workings of money, how money is made, how today's financial system affects every Muslim and non-Muslim in the entire world, and how to relate that to Islam. If the longest ayatul Qur'an is to do with trade, the longest ayah in the Qur'an is to do with trade. What does that tell us? It tells us that the ulama must be learned with regard to different types of trades. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu was a trader. He traveled to the Roman Empire. He interacted with the Romans. And that is why he was, one of the reasons why he was able to establish such a khilaf. So today, the students of knowledge must gain knowledge of the world around them. One student, he was traveling with me, and while they were traveling, I said, switch on the, because now you can listen to things on the road. He said, what shall I play? I said, play a documentary on Roman Britain, on the history of how Julius Caesar invaded Britain and Roman Britain. He said to me, that's boring. Now, I said to him, do you have any general knowledge of the country you live in, Britain? He said, no. I said, that is haram for you. That you live in this country and you do not have general knowledge of the land you live in. To simplify this, I gave him two examples. I said, do you think the pious people of the past were ignorant of the world around them? Of course they were not. They will learn it regarding the world around them. Read the tafsir of Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi when he talks about the history and the ruins and the artifacts in the lands that he lived in, modern day Afghanistan. He talks about the artifacts and the history. Similarly, I said to him, when you read the seerah, the biography of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had interactions with the Byzantine Roman Empire. There was the Battle of Tabuk, or the expedition of Tabuk. The expedition of Tabuk, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam took nearly 30,000 Sahaba to face the Romans. Or there was the Sahabi Suhaib al-Rumi radiallahu an, who was from Rum. I said to him, if you are ignorant of Rome, the Roman Empire, and you think that makes you look more religious, it does not make you look more religious. There are people today, they will grow big beards, they will wear the biggest imama, but when you ask them about general knowledge, they will say that is not a religious subject. That is incorrect. The people of the past in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Qahira, all the Islamic capitals, they established centers of learning. And they will learn it with regard to the world around them. So do not think for 1 second that when you study the deen of al-Islam, being ignorant of the world around you makes you more pious. That does not make you more pious. Being pious means you avoid haram. You avoid haram. Whatever is haram, you avoid. Like today we went to the Amsterdam city, we avoided haram. We avoided the areas where there is haram. We avoided the cannabis cakes. We avoided everything else. But that doesn't mean you be ignorant of Amsterdam city. You must have knowledge of the city. And that is how the Muslim should be, in order to spread the deen of al-Islam. And in order that we are able to convey the deen of al-Islam to the new generation, as well as the non-Muslims living in this region.